Is the 401k or an annuity better for retirement income? Welcome, my name is Daniel. I currently serve a few dozen clients, and the true, unsatisfying answer is it depends. Today, let's first look at the pros and cons of both of those. Then we'll look at a side-by-side comparison showing the incomes of each of those, how much is left over, etc. Then what happens if we combine the two strategies into a half and half or some sort of split there? And finally, what does this mean for you? What does it all come down to? Let's get into it. First, the 401k, we're just going to look at some very basic pros and cons. So we'll start here on the pros. That is the tax-deferred growth, so there's no taxes on gains before withdrawing. The same thing is going to be the case with an annuity. Also, with the money that's in the stock market, at least that's the typical setup within a 401k, you have the opportunity for higher returns. Of course, this could result in much higher income or leaving much more money behind, even if you are taking a similar income to an annuity. That's a pretty obvious one, but still important to point out. The typical withdrawal strategy is the 4% rule. Of course, there's newer studies out now that maybe go a little bit higher than that maybe, depending on your strategy, that's going to change throughout your retirement. However, that accounts for inflation, where most annuities, and not all, but most tend to not do that. You usually get like a flat rate forever. The examples we'll look at today are under that assumption, but there are some that do adjust for inflation. With the 401k using the 4% rule or some rule like that, you have that benefit. Also, you can withdraw varying amounts each year very easily. With the annuity, you'll see in a second that might not just be the case. Now, for cons, with the 401k, all money is fully taxable. That's also the same thing with an annuity, assuming you are rolling over a 401k into an annuity. Obviously, you can do that with like a Roth IRA, for example, and they might be tax-free. But we are assuming, just to keep things equal here when comparing them, that both of them are fully taxable. Market volatility, so you can lose money. Of course, if you have money in the stock market, again, this isn't obvious, but market volatility is in play. If 2008 happens again, if what's going on with Trump's tariffs right now continues to get worse and worse, you can lose a good chunk of change. Of course, in the long run, the hope is that even when the market goes down, you hold in there and you'll end up making those gains and then some back. There's also the sequence of returns risk. This is very important especially when considering retirement income and not just how the money grows. But what that basically is let's say you had $1 million, you're doing that 4% rule, and you start taking out 4% a year, you're going to want that to adjust for inflation each year. But the first 2 years, for example, the market goes down 10 and then 15% back to back. Well, that's not very good. If the market starts out doing well the first 7 years and then later into retirement when you have less money or you've built a bigger nest egg, then you hit that bad 2 year in a row period, well, it's not as detrimental then. But the sequence of that return, basically how early that happens or how frequently that happens early on, can be much more of a detrimental thing, especially early into withdrawing from a 401k for retirement income. With annuities, if you have that guaranteed number just there forever, of course, what the market does is just going to affect how much death benefit is actually there to leave behind, but not your income. There's also no guarantees of income, so again, you could run out. If the sequence of returns risk is not panning out in your favor, or for whatever reason, markets are going down, you're over withdrawing, you could run out of money. Again, probably not that likely if you're using a sound strategy, at least compared to what you might have been planning for if your portfolio isn't performing as you hoped it would have. And then also, usually, not all, you don't have to keep your 401k with an advisor, or maybe your advisor doesn't charge as much, but usually you're going to pay around a 1 to 1.5% per year charge to the advisor. So if you're gaining 8% and you're paying 1.5, well, you might only actually be gaining 6.5 in that given year. Now let's move on to the pros and cons of the annuity. First, we'll start with the pros. Again, you can turn on guaranteed income for life with the option to continue paying out to spouse upon death. So that would be if you annuitized or you use some sort of rider, like a guaranteed lifetime withdrawal benefit, in the joint form instead of single. So if you turned on guaranteed income for $1 million, you put it in and you turned it on immediately. If you took that single, just going to use the example here of a 60-year-old male or female, it actually doesn't matter what gender you are in terms of how much income you're going to get guaranteed. at least for the companies that I'm aware of. That might not be the case with all of them, but if you turn that on, you might get, say, $65,000 a year guaranteed for the rest of your life. If you turn that on jointly with you and your spouse, let's say your spouse is also 60 years old, that means if you pass away first, she would continue to receive that income. If she passed away first, you would continue to receive that income. In that case, instead of getting closer to $65,000, that's going to be reduced a little bit, but you do have that option. Another big pro, and this is the main thing, market volatility does not affect current or future income, at least with most annuities are the ones we're going to be talking about today. Now, there is variable annuities, there are fixed index annuities that this could actually be the case. Again, the ones that we're going to be talking about today are very simple, where the market might affect how long the death benefit lasts, but not how much income you're actually able to take. Or also there's some where it could affect only on the upside, where if the market performs well for 7 to 10 years, then you're going to get more income than it had projected if you had deferred that income out, for example, in an annuity. But if it underperforms, it's not going to hurt the guarantees that you have. So, hey, we'll get at least this much guaranteed. If the market performs above it, you'll get more. But we definitely will guarantee you that if the market doesn't perform well or quite as well as the guarantees that we have there, you'll get that no matter what. Two other pros we're going to go here. Withdrawal rates are typically much higher than 4% a year. I will point out, though, money will run out quicker with this. We'll see that on the next slide on the side-by-side comparison. And most annuities, again, as I had pointed out before, are not adjusting for inflation over time. So even though you might get that 6.5% payout, well, that might be consistent forever, but it's that same $65,000 every single year. It's not adjusting each year. Another pro here is that you can still access money if needed, and the death benefit will still be intact when receiving income. So with more traditional annuities, this wasn't the case, basically meaning you had to annuitize the annuity. You snap your fingers, you turn it on, and now they're going to pay you this $65,000 for life. But if you pass away 2 years in, sorry, you died early, you lost the deal, we're keeping all of the rest of that $1 million that you gave us. More modern annuities, that's not the case. The death benefit will still pass on for the money you didn't receive, usually a little bit more than that as well if the money grew. And then also if you need to cancel, if you need to access a small portion, usually up to about 10%, it varies, you can do that without having to be penalized for taking that money out. Again, with the more traditional annuities, once you annuitized the annuity, you weren't able to access or do any sort of canceling with the policy. That's not the case with more modern ones. Again, not all of them. Just going to keep throwing that caveat out there. Just want to make sure I'm precise in my language. And then let's look at some of the cons. Income payouts don't increase each year with inflation. We went over that. High returns are much more unlikely. Again, that doesn't mean it's not possible. I just would not rely on it. I'd be very skeptical of anyone who's getting into an annuity with the idea with, look, I'm not going to lose when the market goes down. That's awesome. I'm only going to perform when the market goes up, and I'm expecting to get stock market-like returns. That is something, again, as I just said that before, I'd be a little skeptical of. These are not vehicles that you're going to use to try and beat the 401k with performance. Instead, you're doing it for the guarantees, not the performance. Two other things here: less likely to leave money behind to beneficiaries in the long term, at least, just because the money's going to run out sooner. You'll see that in the next slide. And there's the surrender period generally. So if you are trying to access the money within the first 10 years, for example, you've got that 10% free window. But if you go above that, you might have to pay a surrender charge. Usually that might be, if it's a 10-year surrender schedule, the first year, maybe it's a 10% charge if you go above accessing more than 10% of your money. The next year it's 9, 8, 7, and it'll slowly get lower until after that surrender period's up, your surrender charge is 0. You could withdraw all of your money penalty free. Now we're going to look at a side-by-side comparison of taking income from $1 million from a 401k using the typical 4% rule versus putting that into an annuity, taking immediate income and taking that single. We are assuming you're using the guaranteed lifetime withdrawal benefit. We assumed the balance here grew at, I believe it was 3.5%. We'll double check on that. And we assumed the 401k, I believe we chose 7%. So again, I'll check those here in a second. We're going to switch over to the screen and play with these numbers a little bit. But first thing you notice here, and I put this on the right, I've mentioned this before, the 401k, you're more likely to get higher returns. The money's going to last much longer. The annuity, you have the guarantees. This is the thing that we really need to hammer into our brains. Now, just looking at the income here, you see that 40,000, it's much lower than the 65,000 initially. The balance is even higher with an annuity. This, again, just the specific example that we used. And then the 40,000 continues to grow over time. So it doesn't hit that 65,000 until about 15 years in. 65,000 is still being paid out here. So go down to around 22 years in, you're getting 82,000 on the 401k. You're still only getting that 65 with the annuity. In this case, it runs out of money here, where if you passed away at age 84, you don't leave any money behind with the annuity. If you would have lived longer, you would have still had that 65,000 guaranteed, but with the 401k, you're still getting the income and you leave a whopping 1.7 almost million behind to beneficiaries. Okay, now a couple things here. First, we are assuming with the 401k that you're taking in lump sum at the beginning of the year instead of taking monthly payments. Same thing with the annuity. We assumed that. I mentioned this here before, but we're assuming a male taking single, not joint income with a fixed index annuity using a guaranteed lifetime withdrawal benefit immediately at age 60. I also, if you look in this calculation here, yes, I was assuming a 3.5% growth rate per year on the death benefit with the annuity. You subtract the income from that. And then here I was assuming a 7%, if you continue to scroll down and look at what I'm putting here, a 7% gain every single year on the 401k. Now, what are a couple things to consider? First, I want to just show the total amount of income that you take in both of these. If you lived all the way until age 90, so if we look at this here, you're taking, and let me make these colorful, you are taking 2.1 million, a little more than that in the 401k. You're taking just above 2 million in the annuity and income. The difference here is these numbers right here. You have much more behind or to leave behind to heirs with the 401k in this example than you did with the annuity. Now, if you passed away earlier, you didn't live all the way to age 90, let's say it was age 78, for example, that you passed away. So let's change this here to, let's call it 59, 77, we'll say. Then, if we move this here, so that's 59, we'll see that you took $1.17 million worth of income with the annuity and a little less than $1 million with the 401k. So depending on how long you live, you might get more income with the annuity. The longer you live, the 401k is going to look better. Now, that's if the 401k was getting that 7% withdrawal rate, or that 7% gain, rather, every single year, and it was continuing to compound. Now, with the sequence of returns risk, let's look at a couple different things here. So first, what happens if we were averaging, let's call it 6% every single year instead of 7? So first we're going to do 6 and look at things like that. Okay, so we can see there's a little bit less money that's leaving behind, still much more than the annuity. And then what I also want to take a look at is, let's change it back to 7, but then let's kind of mix in a series of different varying returns. So if we looked at the history of the S&P 500, if you were retiring in one of those decades where the beginning decades had a lot of wins, maybe 8 of the years were up, and the 2 years that were down weren't down very much, that's fantastic. If you retired in the early 2000s, right before the COVID crash, for example, perhaps right with what's going on right now with tariffs, then things might look a little uglier. So if we put, for example, let's say the first year it did gain 7%, and the next year we'll say that it lost 9%. And then the next year it lost 5%. And then you went right back to, let's say you had a 20% gain, then you had a 15% gain, then the next year you lost, we'll say it was 15%, and then from there it just continued into perpetuity with the 7% gains. Well, just having that starting little volatility there, you can see the massive difference it makes on how much money you actually have left behind. In fact, you go negative at age 89, whereas before, if we just assume that 7% compound growth, we had 1.7 million here. So a very small change in performance over one small period of time can make that much different than just looking at this is what happens if we got this growth forever into perpetuity. On the flip side, also need to point out that you could have a very short period where it's the opposite case, where it does 20%, then 30%, then 20% the next year, and now those losses don't affect you as much, and you have much more than that 1.7 million later on in life. The point here, again, is just to show you with the 401k, you have more volatility that you're going to deal with, but you also can have much greater returns. With the annuity, you have less volatility that you're dealing with, but you have the income there guaranteed forever. Also, this is not including any sort of income coming from Social Security. Just want to point that out. Now let's look at a combination of the two strategies. So you didn't want to go all 401k, you didn't want to go all guarantees. What does it look like if we did a half and half here? So I switched it to 500,000 for each of them. So we guaranteed half of the income from the annuity, 32.5 thousand into perpetuity, and then we're using the 4% rule on the other 500,000 there with the 401k. Total income is here on the right. Again, this is assuming that 7% guaranteed forever. This could be a nice hedge against having like that baseline guaranteed. So say that 32.5 thousand on top of Social Security is more than enough to make sure that you can continue living the lifestyle that you want to live into perpetuity. But the 401k, you know, is more likely to yield higher returns over time. So you're fine with keeping that money in the market. You've got your guarantees here with the annuity plus Social Security. You have that peace of mind there. It's going to continue to grow because the cost of living adjustment with Social Security. But over here, you have the 401k that's still in the market, still dealing with volatility, but you're totally fine with that. This is what this would look like. Again, much more income in those earlier years than just doing the full 401k, a little bit less income in the later years because you mixed the strategies between guarantees and 401ks, but you do have Social Security that's still increasing with the cost of living adjustment. So finally, what does it all come down to for you? Should you use the 401k or an annuity for your retirement income? I used a little graphic here to try to make this in plain, as simple as possible. Hopefully I've been alluding to this throughout the video and you've been starting to pick up on it. The unsatisfying answer though is it comes down to your goals. If the stock market stresses you out and you look stressed pretty frequently like this guy here, maybe you consider more guarantees with annuities. If you love shooting for the high returns, you don't worry about market volatility, you're fine with losing money in the stock market, maybe you consider the 401k because your goals might be to make higher returns, to take a higher income, to leave more money behind to heirs. You're not really concerned about those guarantees. You're shooting for the stars. If that's the case, maybe you're keeping all of your money outside of guaranteed strategies aside from Social Security, like 401ks. If you're in between there, you want some guarantees, you do stress about the market a little bit, but you also really want to make sure you have that balance of leaving money behind to kids, not missing out if the market does well. Maybe you consider a mix of both. Hopefully this video was helpful. If it was, please do subscribe. I release videos multiple times a week trying to go into great detail on strategies, all things retirement. Try to be unbiased. Maybe sometimes it doesn't come off like that, but hopefully you felt that way. Subscribe and I will see you in a future video. Bye-bye.